The city of Makola, nestled at the intersection of trade routes and ancient traditions, was a sensory overload. Its streets were filled with a cacophony of sounds, vendors hawking their goods, motorbikes blaring their horns, and children laughing as they darted between stalls. The air was heavy with the mingling scents of spiced suya, fresh fish grilling over open flames, and ripe mangoes stacked high in wooden crates. For Ifeoma, a journalist known for her sharp instincts and daring investigations, Makola's vibrant energy was both her muse and her battlefield. Food had always fascinated her, not just as nourishment but as a window into culture and community. Her column, The Flavor of Makola, delved into the stories behind the dishes that defined the city. But one investigation would change everything for Ifeoma. It began innocently, a desire to profile the city's hidden culinary gems, but spiraled into a nightmare she would never forget. It was a rainy afternoon when Ifeoma first stumbled upon Mama Coco's kitchen, a tiny, unassuming eatery tucked into a dimly lit alley. She had been exploring the less-traveled streets of Makola, searching for inspiration for her next piece. The sign outside was simple, hand-painted with faded letters, but the aroma wafting from inside stopped her in her tracks. The rich, intoxicating scent of egusi soup and grilled meats enveloped her. Peering through the window, she saw a handful of patrons seated at rustic wooden tables, their faces lit with satisfaction as they ate. The atmosphere felt warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the drizzling rain outside. Inside, Ifeoma was greeted by a plump woman with a gap-toothed smile and a vibrant wrapper tied around her waist. Her eyes twinkled with a knowing warmth. "Welcome, my daughter," the woman said, her voice like honey. "You've come to the right place. Sit down, and let me take care of you." "I'll try the egusi soup," Ifeoma said, settling into a corner table. Mama Coco brought her the food herself, the dish steaming and fragrant. "Happiness is in the taste," she said with a wink before retreating to the kitchen. With the first bite, Ifeoma was hooked. The flavors were rich, layered, and unlike anything she had tasted before. It wasn't just good, it was extraordinary. In the days that followed, Ifeoma found herself thinking about Mama Coco's food more often than she cared to admit. She returned, not just to eat but to observe. It wasn't long before she realized she wasn't the only one drawn to the place. Word had spread, and Mama Coco's kitchen was quickly becoming one of Makola's most popular dining spots. What struck Ifeoma was the loyalty of the customers. Many came every day, their faces glowing with anticipation as they devoured their meals. Even prominent figures, business tycoons, politicians, and socialites, could be seen slipping into the tiny eatery, a stark contrast to the upscale restaurants they usually frequented. But there was something else Ifeoma couldn't ignore. The customers' reactions seemed off. They ate with an almost hypnotic intensity, their eyes glassy and their movements mechanical. When asked about the food, they all said the same thing: it's happiness on a plate. Ifeoma's journalist instincts kicked in. What made Mama Coco's food so addictive? And why did her patrons seem to leave the restaurant in a daze? One evening, as Ifeoma dined at Mama Coco's kitchen, an incident unfolded that sent chills down her spine. At a table near hers, a man in a sharp suit suddenly clutched his chest and slumped forward, knocking over his bowl of pepper soup. The other diners barely reacted. 2 staff members swiftly appeared, lifting the man and carrying him into the kitchen. The calm efficiency of their movements was unsettling, as though this wasn't the first time such a thing had happened. "What's going on?" Ifeoma asked a waitress, but the woman only smiled. "Don't worry, madam. It's nothing serious. He just needs some air." The man didn't return to his seat, and Ifeoma left that night with a growing sense of unease. Something wasn't right. Determined to dig deeper, Ifeoma decided to investigate. Her first step was to learn more about Mama Coco herself, but this proved surprisingly difficult. None of the city's food suppliers claimed to work with her, and her name wasn't listed in any local directories. She seemed to have appeared in Makola out of nowhere. One night, Iphioma staked out the restaurant from a shadowed corner of the alley. She watched as large sacks were carried into the kitchen by two men, their movements hurried and deliberate. The sacks were stained dark, and Iphioma's heart raced as she imagined what might be inside. The next morning, she approached a regular diner and asked about the ingredients in Mama Coco's dishes. The woman's expression became guarded. "Mama Coco's recipes are special," she said with a faint smile. "It's best not to ask too many questions." Iphioma returned to the restaurant the following day, this time under the pretense of interviewing Mama Coco for her column. "Your food is incredible," she said, trying to mask her growing suspicion. "I'd love to know more about your process." Mama Coco beamed with pride but remained vague, deflecting questions with charming anecdotes about her childhood. As they talked, Iphioma noticed a locked door at the back of the kitchen. Unlike the other doors, it was reinforced and bore a strange symbol carved into the wood. "What's behind that door?" Iphioma asked casually. Mama Coco's smile faltered for a split second before she laughed. "Just storage, my dear. Nothing exciting." That night, Iphioma returned to the restaurant under the cover of darkness. Using a hairpin, she managed to pick the lock on the back door and slipped inside. The kitchen was quiet, the faint smell of spices lingering in the air. She crept toward the locked door and, to her surprise, found it slightly ajar. Inside, the room was cold and dimly lit by the flicker of candles. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars of powders and strange objects, bones, feathers, and dried herbs. At the center of the room was an altar draped in red cloth, and beneath it lay several large sacks. Iphioma's hands trembled as she opened one of the sacks. What she saw made her stomach churn. It contained human remains. Iphioma barely made it out of the room before she ran into Mama Coco, who was blocking her path. Gone was the warm, maternal woman she had met weeks ago. Her eyes burned with fury, and her voice was low and menacing. "You shouldn't have gone in there," she said, her tone eerily calm. "What are you doing here?" Iphioma demanded, trying to mask her fear. "What is this place?" Mama Coco's lips curled into a sinister smile. "You wanted to know my secret, didn't you? The spirit of happiness demands sacrifices, my daughter. And now that you know, you're part of it." Two men appeared from the shadows, their faces blank and their movements robotic. They grabbed Iphioma, dragging her toward the altar as Mama Coco began chanting in a language Iphioma didn't understand. Desperation fueled Iphioma's struggle. She grabbed a nearby pot and swung it at one of her captors, knocking him to the ground. Breaking free, she sprinted through the kitchen, knocking over shelves and pots in her path. Behind her, Mama Coco's voice rang out, "You can't escape my daughter. The spirits will find you." Bursting into the street, Iphioma screamed for help, but the alley was deserted. She didn't stop running until she reached the safety of her apartment. The next day, Iphioma reported everything to the police. But when they arrived at the restaurant, the room with the altar was gone, and the staff denied any wrongdoing. Mama Coco greeted them with her familiar warm smile, playing the role of an innocent restaurateur. Frustrated but undeterred, Iphioma wrote a detailed exposé for her column, describing everything she had seen. The story caused a stir, and many of Mama Coco's regulars stopped visiting the restaurant. Within weeks, the eatery closed its doors. Though Mama Coco disappeared, Iphioma couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. She became hyper-aware of the food she ate, cooking every meal herself and avoiding restaurants altogether. The experience left her haunted, a constant reminder of the dangers lurking behind seemingly harmless meals. Moral: trust your instincts, question what's on your plate, and remember, some sacrifices aren't worth the taste.